huge spike in fuel prices that they're experiencing at the moment.
The Prime Minister seemed a little cautious with the ceasefire. He said a suggestion of or a possibility of a ceasefire. Do you think it's likely to actually be a ceasefire?
I think we can welcome the news that there does seem to have been some agreement. It's only hours old. We need to now hope that goodwill, if there is any goodwill, will continue and that this ceasefire will actually happen. What was that? Oh, Donald Trump needs to accept responsibility for this war happening in the first place. It's caused huge instability. The outcomes that he was looking for of regime change clearly hasn't happened. There has not been regime change in Iran, and it's still not clear what a successful outcome from the perspective of the United States would actually be.
Do you think that the words "a whole civilization dying tonight" are the words of a stable world leader?
Those were absolutely disgraceful, and New Zealand should condemn them in the strongest possible terms. Threatening to wipe out an entire population because you're not getting what you want is not acceptable. It would be a violation of international law. Threatening to kill innocent civilians because you're not getting what you want is completely unacceptable.
The Prime Minister described those comments as incredibly unhelpful. Do you think he could have been stronger?
They're more than unhelpful. This is an absolute disgrace. Threatening to kill innocent civilians, bombing schools, threatening to blow up bridges and power stations that are civilian infrastructure. These would all be totally and utterly wrong in any circumstance, and the Prime Minister's inability to find a backbone and condemn them is an indictment on New Zealand's current approach to foreign policy. Well, the Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters' appeasement strategy isn't working for New Zealand either. They decided to stay quiet on tariffs, and the tariff that was being charged to New Zealand went up.
So if you want the government being stronger in its language and resulted in a tariff hike adding further pain to New Zealand should speak principally. Let me find a different word. New Zealand should speak with principle on the international stage, standing up for the values that matter to New Zealand, as we have always done previously. And we can do that without compromising our ongoing relationships. If you look at our exchange with China, for example, we've spoken out on human rights, and yet our trading relationship with them has continued to expand. If that did result in a tariff hike, you would see that as well.
That's a hypothetical question that I'm not even going to entertain. Look, I certainly hope that it won't come to that. Obviously, I hope that there will be a permanent and lasting ceasefire that will allow free movement through the strait to resume.
Because what implications would that have of freedom of movement, for ship across the world if that was implemented?
That in itself would be a violation of international law. So, no, we should in no way condone that. Tax. Yeah. New Zealand should not be condoning a tax on transit through the Strait of Hormuz.
If the ceasefire did continue smoothly as it's proposed today, how quickly would you expect relief to come to the pump for Kiwis?
Well, that is a question that the government needs to provide some more certainty for. So if there is more free movement through the strait, what is that going to mean for fuel prices in New Zealand? How quickly can we expect to see fuel prices coming down? It seems to me, having watched the fuel companies over many, many years, they're very fast to see the prices go up. It seems to take a lot longer for them to come down again.
Usually it would be within a week of the price movement for it to be reflected in fuel prices there, but all of that does depend on whether the ceasefire really works or not. So can, I guess, cut fuel companies a little bit of leeway to just maybe wait and see what the outcome of this is?
So, I think that the fuel companies need to do a better job of explaining why fuel prices have gone up now, even though the price that they will have paid for the fuel that's already in the country won't be reflecting that. I think they could do a better job of explaining that, and in the process of explaining that, they could also give New Zealanders some indication of when they would expect to see some downward movement. What would they need to see, and for how long?
The US seems open to support
Right now, the New Zealand government should be talking to everyone it possibly can to secure as much fuel security as we possibly can. The Australians are doing that. They're clearly working their networks around the globe to secure as much fuel as they possibly can get. New Zealand should be doing the same. And yes, we should also be advocating for the Pacific. I think that if the US are willing to provide some security around fuel supplies to the Pacific, that's a very good thing. And we should certainly be using our diplomatic channels to support that. I think it was disappointing that Winston Peters wasn't strong enough in his language around New Zealand's condemnation, what should be New Zealand's condemnation for this war. You shouldn't need to wait for the United States to explain why they blew up a school to know that blowing up a school is the wrong thing to do.
Is Chris Hipkins and the government in a difficult position?
New Zealand's government has always been principled, well, not always, let me start that again. New Zealand has a history of their government being principled on international matters, even where that puts us offside with some of our close friends, and we should continue to be that way.
Just think we're still a close friend. Winston Peters was asked that today. What do you think of that relationship?
The US-New Zealand relationship is an incredibly important one to us, but we also have to recognise that the US's posture when it comes to the rest of the world has changed, and that's likely to be a lasting change. We need to adapt to that. The way the United States views the rest of the world is different now to what it was 10 years ago.
How would you characterise that? How do you see the rest of the world?
It's certainly a much more inward-looking approach than we've seen from the United States. I think it's likely to be a lot less connected on a range of security issues, where previously the United States has been a very integral security partner around the world. I think they've retreated from that. And on issues around trade, I think we're likely to see further strengthening of protectionism from the United States. So their overall approach has changed, and I don't think you can put that down to one single administration. I think that is likely to be a lasting change in the US's posture.
Can I get your thoughts on the official cash rate and inflation?
I think it's certainly welcome. People will welcome the fact that the OCR's stayed on hold. Still too soon to say what the long-term trajectory will be. I think if you look at the comments the Reserve Bank have been making, not just today but in recent weeks, they are talking about the fact that households are not as well prepared to shoulder a spike in costs now compared to what they were when we last saw a fuel spike back in 2022. So households' finances are in a weaker position now than they were 4 years ago.
It's a difficult time to do any forecasting at the moment. I mean, the Treasury is probably going to be struggling with that, but a lot of what they've indicated is into their budget forecasts.
I think the Treasury in preparing the budget will need to be a bit more upfront about the range of scenarios that they are modelling. I think we can all understand that there's going to be quite a lot of width in those scenarios, from best case scenario to worst case scenario. The numbers could look quite different, but the Treasury should be upfront with New Zealanders about what they think a best case or a worst case scenario and all the other scenarios in between might look like.
Would you be going to Singapore sooner than May 1st if you were Prime Minister?
I think if the opportunity arises, I would fully support him going earlier if he has the chance to do that.
When you say that New Zealand should be talking to every country possible, everyone possible to secure fuel supply, could you say what you would want to be offered at the table, or what countries you would not want to have those conversations with?
Russia should certainly be off the table. That's a very principled position that we've had, and a bipartisan agreement on that across the chamber, across the House. We should stick with that. But we should certainly be talking to all of those like-minded countries, including, as much as we may disagree with them on Iran, we should be talking to the US, major oil supplier around the world. We should be doing everything that we can to try and secure fuel supplies for New Zealand.
Yesterday in New Zealand had a bunch of flights around regional New Zealand. The Prime Minister said it has to remain profitable, but is there an argument, do you think, for the government to step in to keep these regions connected?
I recognise the difficulty Air New Zealand faces. I saw the message out from them this morning that indicated their daily cost of jet fuel's more than doubled in the last few weeks. That's going to flow through in two ways. One is they're going to be significantly increasing their prices. The second is that they will be looking to drop flights. The government does need to be communicating with Air New Zealand about ensuring that regions can stay connected. That may mean some thinning of the flight schedules, but making sure regional New Zealand remains connected is very important.
So at this stage, no airport's been cut off
I don't think there's a case for that. When the government needs to be making sure that New Zealanders can still get around. Air travel is only one of the ways that we do that. Yeah. So we're waiting for a response back from the government, a formal response back from the government. We did have an opportunity for a few of our MPs to review some documentation. It wasn't all the documentation we asked for, but last week they got to see a limited range of that documentation. Much of that has not addressed the questions that I put in the letter that I sent to Christopher Lux, and so we're still waiting for a formal response on that. And then the Labour caucus, the next meeting of the Labour caucus will be on the first Tuesday back, when Parliament's back after the current recess, and that'll be our first opportunity to discuss our position as a party.
Are you expecting to make a decision at that point?
Well, it depends on the government's response. So the substantive issues that we have raised with the government have yet to be addressed. So if they can address those issues, we may be in a position to make a decision. But at this point, they've just been dismissing them. The public statements that Todd McLean and Christopher Luxon have been making, in my view, contradicts the wording of the agreement. So until they can reconcile those things, we're not likely to be in a position to make a final decision.
In your view, why aren't they providing that detail?
Well, because the things that they've been saying publicly aren't what's in the text of the agreement, and they really need to explain that to New Zealanders.
Is it the case that Damien O'Connor worked with the minister in terms of when they were both overseas to go through these issues? How is that not enough for the Labour Party?
There have been a lot of ongoing conversations at a number of levels, including between Todd McLean and Damien O'Connor. We've also met with the Minister of Immigration. We've had a range of discussions, but at this point they still haven't actually addressed the substantive issues. We're getting a lot of reassurance from them, but the reassurance isn't backed up by any facts.
What material did you ask for that hasn't been supplied? Is it that you'd asked for a large amount? It's only something.
So the only advice that we've had access to is the advice provided by MFAT. We haven't had any access to the information provided by immigration officials, for example. We had the opportunity to meet with NZQA to talk about PTE quality assurance. That's a good thing. A lot of that work was work I started as Minister of Education, and I'm strongly supportive of it. But they weren't able to talk to us about what would happen if we started to see international students being exploited in the labour market, because that sits with immigration. And we haven't had responses back or any information back from immigration on those issues. We haven't had information back on the 33 billion New Zealand dollars that they're committing to export. So they're basically saying that we will export $33 billion of investment from New Zealand into India at a time when we're desperate for that investment here in New Zealand. They haven't explained where they think that money is going to come from, or how they even think that's a realistic thing to sign us up for.
Have you had access to legal advice from MFAT on that?
No. No, they haven't given us access to any of the legal advice, and they also haven't given us the negotiating mandate.
Would you expect to have either of those?
Well, certainly if we were the government, we would know what the negotiating mandate was. They are asking for our support as if we were part of the government, because the ministers who are in the government, who have had access to that information, don't support it. I don't think you'd call it oversight given the number of times we've asked for it. Well, for whatever reason, they clearly don't want to give us access to the advice that the immigration officials have provided to them in negotiating this agreement.
Can I just ask another topic
Yeah.
quickly? On the law changes that allowed MSD to claw back debt from ACC back payments,
Yes.
Labor didn't submit the amendments to remove abuse and care victims, or survivors, until well late in the process. Do you accept that if those amendments had been brought forward, like during the first reading or earlier, they may have got accepted?
Well, we got the bill on the day of the first reading, so we didn't have the opportunity to do anything more than we did. We worked as quickly as we could, bearing in mind that this bill was introduced and given its first reading on the same day, and it was only after we negotiated a week-long select committee process that we had any opportunity to change it. So we were trying to work in good faith with the government to address what is a legitimate issue, but also with a bit more compassion than what the government were willing to show.
Would Labor support it if the government did bring forward legislation to defer or scrap the plan to increase excise tax?
Absolutely. I don't think the government should be planning to increase excise tax next year. We've certainly got to see a sustained downward pressure on fuel prices. We need to see a sustained drop in fuel prices before there could be any discussion about that. And I think we're unlikely to see that for some time.
Are you concerned about the implications that would have on
Not necessarily. We've still got, a huge number of unfunded transport projects that the current government can't answer how they're going to fund. Do we need to have a conversation about what we can afford to do in terms of new roads and road upgrades as a country? Yes, we do, because even with a fuel tax increase, the current government can't pay for all the promises that they've made.
I mean, your government was planning to hike fuel taxes 3 years ago. That obviously hasn't happened, so there's a gap there in transport funding to meet your commitments. And now there's going to be another gap. This isn't sustainable, is it?
The Infrastructure Commission were pretty upfront in their advice around what's affordable and what's not, and saying that our current ambitions as a country, largely dictated by what the government have said their ambition is unaffordable. So we do need a realistic conversation about what we can afford as a country. Having a whole lot of gold-plated 4-lane roads that the country can't afford still being worked on as we speak now, when there is little prospect of them being built in the next 10 to 15 years, let alone the next 20 to 30 years, I think is not good, and not a good investment right now. So there's some serious prioritisation needed here.
On the English First Directive in the public service, would Labor reverse the rebranding that some agencies have had, such as Tipatuoto going to Health New Zealand?
No, but we also don't think it's the number one issue facing the country. I don't want government departments spending money on rebranding. If they want to use Te Reo Māori in their branding, and if that's already been done, I've got no problem with them continuing with that. We're certainly not going to force them to redo all their signage and stationery because some members of the coalition are on a crusade against Māori language.
If someone's like Health New Zealand under your government decided actually how we want to change that, or we want to change it to a Māori name, and then go through that rebranding exercise, we can tell them that that's probably not a good use of money.
We wouldn't stop them doing that, but our expectation around branding exercises would be clear. I want government departments focused on doing the job that they have to do rather than constantly rebranding. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Mm-hmm.